everyone. We're going to get started. It's wonderful to see all of you here in the room today. And I think there's also, I'm seeing many people popping up on Zoom. So welcome to those of you joining online. I'm Mariah Besharov. I'm professor of organizations and impact here at Said Business School and also the academic director of the School Center for Social Entrepreneurship. I'm really delighted to be welcoming you here today for the Insights for Action seminar. The seminar series broadly looks at how researchers and practitioners within Oxford and beyond are using research insights for action. Today, we're talking about the Oxford Climate Tech Initiative's new report, the Climate Tech Opportunity, and we have two of the authors here with us, along with another founder and funder who's an entrepreneur who's been involved in the space. The report, I'll just give a very brief intro to the report and the people who are in conversation today, and then we'll turn it over to them for the discussion. The report looks at the evolving climate tech field, lessons for financing and lessons for scaling this field and the ecosystem to develop more impactful climate tech solutions. We have here today Dr. Abrar Chowdhury, who is a senior research fellow at Said Business School, who focuses research on global environmental change, climate finance, and corporate purpose. Abrar works with us in our measuring, scaling, and finance initiatives here at the School Center, along with work at many other parts of the business school, and also with the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford. And he's also affiliated with Green Templeton College. So welcome, Abrar. Abrar is one of the co-authors of the report. And then joining us by Zoom, we have Jamil Wyne, who is another co-author, really a lead author of the report, and also an advisor, investor, and educator who focuses on climate technology and investment around the world. Jamil co-founded Riffle Ventures and also was the founder of the Climate Tech Bootcamp, which is a pre-accelerator for climate entrepreneurs. So welcome, Jamil. And then also we have Suma Reddy, who is an entrepreneur and educator who focuses on the intersection of entrepreneurship, innovation, and progress. Suma is the founder of Gather, which is a company that's creating robotic tools for farms and farm workers. She's also previously founded other companies in related industries and has a prior career in microfinance and as a Peace Corps volunteer. So welcome, Suma. Really great to have you all in conversation. And I want to start asking Abrar and Jamil to just tell us a little bit about the report. Why did you write it? What were you trying to achieve? And what were some of the key findings?
Well, thank you, Mariah, and thank you everyone for coming. I'll give you a bit of a historical context of why we wanted to actually focus on this report. So I've been working in the climate space for many years now, really initially looking at, how do we look at policy on ground? How do we get action? But one thing that really was missing in that piece, whenever I spoke to policymakers, was, we understand the challenge, right? We understand what's happening on climate, but there isn't a lot of action happening. So how can we actually solve this problem? How do we get solutions on ground? And often that was a big gap, because I could talk about the challenges, but not often how do we solve those challenges. Related to that, another big piece that started to emerge in my work was really this financing piece, that the next question would always be, okay, fine, we understand the problem, where is the money, where are the funding? And if we don't have any money, really we can't solve any problem. So what you're telling us is great, but it's not really helping us. So Jamil and I started talking a while back, and we kind of recognized that we both are very interested in emerging economies. We both interested, I come from Pakistan. For me, there's a huge gap there. And so what we started to see was that, once we're sitting in Oxford, we get to speak to a lot of founders. We get to speak to a lot of VCs. The access here is a lot. There's a lot of people who come in. And so we started noticing that, a lot of people have solutions. They'll come up with ideas, or they'll say, we're a team of 2 or 3 people working together, and these are the solutions we're working on. Or the VCs would talk to us and say, actually, we've just raised a lot of money, and we're really thinking about climate tech and climate implementation. But when I would go back to Pakistan, right, I met the Minister of Climate Change, and I said, okay, so what are you doing on climate? There's a lot of gap here. And his answer actually was one of the big motivators. He told me, he said, Abrar, we understand the challenges, but I don't know what the solutions are. I don't know where the money is. And really, I go on social media, I look at Twitter, and I look at solutions there. Or someone comes to us and says, you know what, you should be doing this. So it's being pushed to us. So really, there's this huge gap. And for us, that became the motivation. We said, you know what, let's go out, let's talk to people, let's actually find out what they're doing, what they're investing in, what are the technologies that investors are focusing on, because it doesn't matter what the key technology is, like what you're investing in. So asking people, finding that information was really valuable. And for us, it was, okay, let's go out, find these opportunities, talk to experts, talk to investors, and then really create a landscape as a basis. So this is not really the end that we're saying, okay, these are the investments you should focus on, but this is actually really the starting point. Because every time the question would be, okay, what are the great opportunities to invest in? Where should we get those financing from? So I'll pause here, but that really was what pushed us to find this, get this opportunity landscape done.
Thank you. Really helpful context. And Jamil, I want to turn to you and ask you to build on that by telling us a little bit about what are the key findings? What are the main messages that you're trying to convey in the report?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mariah. And can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. There's a little bit of background. Sorry. Well, thanks a lot to you, Mariah, and Jessica, and for giving us this platform, and also big thanks for everybody who contributed to the study. I mean, we had over, I think, 200 people in some shape or form that added value, and we're really grateful for all of it. I think, first and foremost, that one of the big reasons we did it, and I'll get to your question and just use this to get to your question, Mariah. But I mean, there's just like a massive knowledge gap around climate tech right now, right? I think we have pretty good knowledge of kind of where VC trends are heading and the types of technologies that are getting backed. But when you compare it to the level of transparency in other sectors that do have a wide range of use cases for technology globally, it's still a little bit of a nascent forest, even though there's a lot of money flowing into it. And so, first and foremost, just wanted to start the conversation on how do you fill some of these knowledge gaps. And where that leads us to the big findings is, I mean, I think we're all on the same page that there's been a really sharp uptick in climate VC over the past several years, which has followed a larger global trend of just an uptick in climate finance writ large, both VC and other. And in a lot of ways that is reflective of a wide range of investors and countries and entrepreneurs coming on board to think more intentionally and strategically about how do you address different climate risks globally. And there's, a lot of different milestones we've hit, right? Like a 40x increase in funding over the past decade. We have over 80 climate unicorns now. And so there's different data points we can identify that say, look, this is by no means a side hustle of a certain group of investors or entrepreneurs. It's actually something that's becoming far more mainstream than ever before, which is really exciting. And something that I think a lot of people take note of, but probably even more people need to be taking note of. And that's one thing we want to do through the report, is also celebrate the work that a lot of people are doing in this space around the world. But I think a couple of the gaps that we noticed, and this is, I would emphasize, like, it's a snapshot of where we are in time rather than a judgment of what we've been able to do so far, meaning that there's, I think, wide consensus that a lot more needs to be done. But on one hand, when we look at the sectors that tend to get a lot of investment, it's an emphasis on transportation, and this is just in climate tech specifically, not global climate finance, but an emphasis on, say, transportation, sectors that we're a lot more familiar with across the board. Energy obviously is a big focus area of a lot of investors too, but things like built environment, agriculture, decarbonizing heavy industry, or just in general, kind of mitigating emissions from heavy industry, including other GHGs. Those are areas that have not received as much investment, which leads us into thinking also about larger thematic areas like climate adaptation, which to date has not received a lot of investment from VCs, and we don't necessarily see as many entrepreneurs building in that area. And at the same time, when you look at some of our successes, like the number of climate unicorns that have gotten investment, we're still seeing kind of similar trends there that you might find in other unicorns, where it's, pretty heavily Western male dominated in terms of who the founders are, a small group of funds that are really focusing on these companies. And so there's room to build out the pie, so to speak, and be more inclusive, which is connected to one of our other findings, was that, by and large, irrespective of who we ask and who we talk to, people are pretty much on the same page that the ecosystem around climate tech is quite how would I say, homogenous still. That there is a need to be expanding it both geographically, sectorally, in terms of the types of founders that are getting involved in building and investing. So big role for a lot of others to play in there. The last thing that I'll flag is that as part of that building of that ecosystem, I think we haven't really started thinking at scale yet. How do we engage corporations and governments in this? It's very much an investor and entrepreneur-led movement, which is oftentimes how these things start. But we have a massive need for more government and like very, very strategic and pragmatic government and corporate involvement, which we can talk a little bit later today. Anyway, I'll pause there and turn back to you, Mariah.
Great, thank you. And I just reflect a little bit after reading the report myself and hearing you highlight some of the key themes. One of the messages that really stands out is that really the need to go from, as you described it, a relatively homogeneous and sort of unified ecosystem, if you will, to one that's much more diverse, that reaches across boundaries, whether that's sectors or geographies or approaches or industries. And we'll talk later about what will it take to do that and what will it take to finance that. But I want to first turn to Suma and ask you to tell us a little bit about Gather and how the findings that we've just heard summarized resonate with your work at Gather and your experience in the climate tech sector more broadly.
Thank you, Mariah. Yeah, I think this report has been really important for three ways, right? For me as an entrepreneur, and I think anyone in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so just to highlight, right, I've been in the climate space for over 12 years, in the impact space for 20 years, started my career in the Peace Corps in Mali, then microfinance in India before jumping to renewable energy infrastructure, then indoor farming, and now agricultural robotics. So Gather, so one, as an entrepreneur, we're obsessive, right? We're trying to solve one specific problem. But what's interesting about climate, right, it is ultimately part of a greater whole and it is systemic. And so what a report like this does for entrepreneurs, right, is enable us to understand how we fit into the greater picture. And people like Jamil and Abrar are doing the work, right, to enable us to see how we fit into the larger picture. And then specifically for Gather, so what we do is we're building simplified, accessible robotic tools for farms and farm workers to increase harvest efficiency and farm worker safety. And the problem that we are trying to address depends on the geography. So in a emerging economy context, right, the agricultural value per farm worker might be 2,000 per farm worker, in a specific country in Africa, while it's 100,000 per farm worker in a country like the US. We do not want to model the US. We know there's been a lot of issues, right, from an ag side and big ag. But what we do understand is that to compete globally, right, we need to increase agricultural value per worker. And then two, very similarly, farm worker illnesses from heat are increasing. Agricultural work, it has a 2x higher incidence of actually dying, not to be dramatic, but it is true. And we also know that specifically in Africa, 42% of women are doing this work, 17% are children, right? And we know that migrants, right, are the majority of the folks doing farm workers, whether it's in the US, in Europe, or elsewhere around the world. And so tools, or mechanization or automation. Sorry, Mariah, I don't know if we lost you.
Yeah, I think Mariah is muted, or the team on the ground is muted. If anybody wants to have a conversation then in parallel.
Well, I'll jump in if there's silence. This is Dan Goldman from Clean Energy Ventures, and Jamil, thanks for inviting me and for the participation in this study. It's just amazing, and I love the work you guys are doing. I think one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is how do we take a lot of the technologies that are really focused on Europe and the US and allow them to proliferate in the global South and emerging markets, and do so in a way that really has impact on their decarbonization, because I think the acceleration of the decarbonization in those countries is paramount to our ability to address climate change. And so if we're developing all these technologies and the priority markets for entrepreneurs is US and Europe, that's not going to work. It's just not enough. And so are you seeing opportunities, funds, places where they can license technology, they can bring manufacturing to these emerging markets that have a lot to offer and a lot of skills and could really participate and at the same time decarbonize their own economies?
Yeah, I think I'll maybe Jamil, I'll
You
speak
should go.
from
You
the
should go. Yeah,
perspective-
and great to hear from you, Dan. I owe you an email. So, but please, Suma, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think 100% feeling this as well. Specifically from a gather context, when we think of agricultural robotics, maybe even just for crop transportation, it's $20,000 a system. So from our perspective, is like, can we get something into the low thousands for a US market to hit small and medium-sized farms, and then translate it into different emerging economy markets. And even reduce the cost. And so one of the vehicles, right, is grants. So Mercy Corps released a really interesting grant up to $100,000 to do pilots. And so those project funding and pilot funding, I think, is an incredible resource, right, to hit the decarbonization goals, right, but of course the climate adaptation goals. Over 70%, Jamil found, right, from his report, believe that we are not hitting vulnerable communities, right? And that includes climate adaptation and inclusion, as long as the decarbonization aspect. So definitely seeing more interest in figuring those solutions out, but, capital and connections becomes a huge piece of connecting those dots.
And I would add to that too. I mean, I know, Dan, you and I have had this conversation several times, and one of the reasons why I owe you an email to catch up on it. I think that one of the big findings for us, which isn't necessarily the most groundbreaking, but there's already so much activity happening in these countries, right? And I think it's something that is easy to forget when we're not physically based there, right? So in some of the work that Suma and I do, we have a team in Senegal that we're collaborating with that's already building ventures out of a studio to focus on different climate risks. I also know that like the COP28 team is launching a few different initiatives for this too. Oops, it looks like the Skull team is now looking at us.
Okay, are they back?
We're here.
Mariah, can you hear us?
That really follows from the challenges that you tee up, right? About the mismatch between the sort of the funding vehicles and the funding needs, and the mismatch between the sectors and the kinds of issues that are funded and where there's a real need, and similarly on geography. And so just tell us a little bit about what will it take, right, to get from here to there, and some of the recommendations that you have in the back end of the report about what we need to be doing to really build the ecosystem that we need for the future.
Yeah. So the report kind of highlights one big element, like the one big gap that we're seeing, especially when it comes to emerging and developing economies, is that the adaptation funding, like we require $400 billion, the actual funding is about $20 billion. And so that gap is huge. And so that recognition is coming in that it's very difficult to get public financing. Like often we rely on governments to come and support countries, right? But governments in many of these emerging countries face the challenge that they have to look at other sectors, right? Health or education. But where we see a huge opportunity is how do we start to bring private sector in this conversation? And I think even when we're having this current COP, which is happening in UAE, we all know that it's being led by one of the largest oil companies in the world, ADNOC. And their justification of bringing the oil company to the forefront, whatever the conflict of interest or whatever the challenges may be, is to say that actually we can't go alone on this. We need to get private sector there. And if we actually put them on the seat, at least that transparency starts to come in, because you can actually question them. So what we're seeing is that, we need to get private sector involved, because ultimately, whatever happens in climate affects not just individuals, but it affects every business. Again, using the example of food, right? who buys food, right? It goes through a lot of these private sector entities. So if there's disruption, it will disrupt them as well. So we're really pushing them to think about their supply chains. The second thing that I think is a big opportunity, and we've also started some research work here, is how do we start to fund small and medium enterprises? You know, often you get a lot of funding for these large organizations. VCs are also looking at, you know, scalable opportunities, or you have development funding that really focuses on local communities, you know, wherever there's huge gaps. And often it's the small and medium enterprises that actually form the backbone of any society, right? Are overlooked. And so we're pushing that, you know, how do we get VCs? How do we get private sector companies to actually start funding them, start bringing them in their value chain? Because I think through that, we can actually generate a lot more funding. For example, I've been supporting through this work, supporting Acumen. They're trying to build a big climate fund in Pakistan. And the idea was, okay, let's not just focus on farmers, but let's look at the small and medium enterprise that sit between these farmers and help them scale, use their expertise, because they're very close on ground, right? They understand what's happening to the farmer, but they also have this notion of business. They want to generate profits. And if you're able to fund them and scale them, that could actually unlock a lot of capital. So I think that's one element. The second element, again, comes from public finance. That, as I said, governments or multilaterals struggle to give enough money, right? And this whole notion of equity in climate change requires that we shouldn't be pushing loans forward, right? Because that's not, you know, you're just creating debt. There isn't enough money for grants. So what the public sector can really do is what we call is de-risk capital. That initially private sector doesn't come in, or investors don't come into these markets because they find it very risky. And what governments and public finance can do is actually come in and say, you know what, actually, we will do the initial investments. We'll give you the infrastructure. We'll help you with the R&D. So if anything goes wrong, you know, your capital will still be protected, but with this promise that you will invest. So the big question here is, how do we go from $20 billion in adaptation funding to $400 billion? And the only route we can see is by getting private sector involved and governments playing a role for unlocking and de-risking, and then having the right policies in place as well that help, you know, these investors to come in. So those would be some of the recommendations, along with many other recommendations that we have within the report.
Great, thank you. Are we back online? Suma and Jamil, can you hear us?
We can hear you beautifully.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Perfect.
So we're going to talk to
Perfect.
you now. Excellent. So Suma, I want to ask you a little bit to reflect on, we'll start by picking up on this, some of the themes that Abrar was just talking about funding. And you've obviously been a founder raising funds. Tell us a little bit about your experience there and how the kinds of challenges that Abrar has pointed out have played out for you, and some of the ways in which you've found really approaches that have worked to build ventures.
Yeah, and it's, everything Abrar is saying is resonating incredibly deeply with me. And so as an entrepreneur, raising money is incredibly difficult. I think raising money for climate ventures can be even more difficult, but there's also this massive opportunity. So I think as an entrepreneur, right, everyone talks about venture capital. Venture capital is a beautiful model, but it does not solve all problems, right? The sort of, let's get 10 to 100x returns in 6 to 10 years, right? Those are specific type of businesses that to date don't often solve are the world's most, you know, challenging societal, economic, climate problems. The good news is there are a lot of alternative types of catalytic capital. And so as an entrepreneur, for example, one might be the nonprofit entrepreneur support organization. Elemental Accelerator, for example, which is based in Hawaii, can give a $350K check at good terms to the entrepreneur, which enables us to start building our companies in a meaningful way. I'm in Memphis. Ag Launch is an agricultural one. that's farmer-centric, where farmers get equity in each company. And there's not even a check involved, actually, but it's a really incredible model. So the Entrepreneur Support Organization, oftentimes funded by government money, if they're a nonprofit, is pretty powerful. Of course, the state and federal grants in the US, that's the Small Business Innovation Research, STTRs, are really important, as Abrar was mentioning, from an R&D perspective. And then you have sort of the global, like Mercy Corps, right? Folks like that who are enabling innovations that might be born in Europe to be piloted in Senegal, right? Or vice versa, right? So I think we're seeing a lot of that. Equity crowdfunding as a model, for those who have heard of that, is happening globally now, with folks like Republic saying, hey, if you can invest $1,000 in a venture, if you have that kind of capital, or even 200 USD, you now have an opportunity to do it. So I get quite excited about sort of all of this catalytic capital options. But as an entrepreneur, it's also incredibly daunting, because you have to understand each stream, and you have to understand each network, and you have to understand each process to be able to fully take advantage of it. But I think, you know, I'm optimistic of what this means in terms of solving climate challenges.
Okay, thank you. So that's sort of a window into the financing piece of what will it take to build the ecosystem. Of course, there are many other pieces. And Jamil, I want to turn to you and just ask you to elaborate a little bit on some of the other aspects that you have in the report, in really the recommendations for what will it take to address the challenges that you've identified. We talked about the financing, but you also have a lot there about developing the talent pipeline, about thinking about the balance of mitigation and adaptation, and other issues as well. So tell us a little bit more, like, what else will it take to really address the challenges that you have surfaced in the report?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mariah. So on one hand, and this is going to sound a little bit wonky, but I think it's good to get everybody on the same page about what an ecosystem actually is, and what it looks like, and what it does, and why we have them, right? If you think about when we say startup ecosystem, people's minds usually go first and foremost to San Francisco and Silicon Valley and New York and Boston and et cetera, and other, you know, obviously other big metro areas around the world have them too. But those ecosystems took, I mean, Silicon Valley still feels like it's sometimes going through evolutionary processes, right? It was something that, government provided funding way back in the 40s or 50s for, and over time it materialized into this really dynamic hub of talent and technology and investment, and people wanted just to live there because it had a fantastic way of life, right? So it became this hub over at least half a century's worth of work. And when we think about building the same ecosystems around climate, we all know what the deadlines look like, right? Like around when we have to hit certain targets, and that's just on the decarbonization front. On the adaptation front, we have to hit those targets even sooner. And so we don't really have time to kind of wait for the same ecosystem evolutionary process to unfold here, right? It's not something that's going to take care of itself. We have, with, using hindsight, we can see what the different pieces look like that have enabled places like Silicon Valley and similar metro areas to have this level of dynamism, wealth creation, job creation, just intellectual firepower. But we have to be extremely intentional and pragmatic in building them. And so to answer your question more squarely now, right now, I think if you ask the average person, what is the state of the climate tech ecosystem? I mean, they probably wouldn't know actually what that means. But if somebody working maybe in the ecosystem, they would probably say, well, we're seeing more VC funding, we're seeing a lot of founders, et cetera. I think we need to realize that investors and founders are just two nodes in a very, very complicated network that enables innovation, right? And so we're not really talking about like alternative models to innovation yet. We're not talking about like talent pipeline development at scale, right? We are just starting to think about it, right? I mean, in the US, we don't have actually like a taxonomy at the Department of Labor around like green jobs. I mean, we're starting kind of from square one when it comes to thinking about how do you pragmatically build a climate tech ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. And I think one of those questions probably has to do with an issue that we touched on earlier that I want to come back to, which is the questions about equity and inclusion, and how do we build an ecosystem that is truly inclusive along all the many dimensions that we've already surfaced, and one that has equity at the heart of it. And so maybe I ask all of you to reflect on that a bit. I'll start with Suma. How do you think about the role of inclusion in the ecosystem and what it will take to build that?
Yeah, I think about it 24/7, and think of inclusion in a couple of ways, right? And I want to give Ian in the thread of questions has asked a really great question. So I think, right, there's inclusion, from the perspective, who is the entrepreneur, who is solving the problems. I think I might be the only queer, lesbian, brown, LGBT, woman ag tech CEO in the US. If you know any others, let me know, right? So there's sort of that, right? Who are the entrepreneurs in the CEO leadership suites, on the boards, and the investors, right? And I think there's a lot of conversation around that. So I think that's important, but equally important is, where are we solving these problems, right? And Ian mentions, right, the global South, and I would say, in terms of the global majority or majority Earth, right? Can we create companies, right, in places that are outside of the biggest innovation ecosystems that we know? And to just give an example of that, our company is based in the Central Valley of California, in a city called Merced. Central Valley is where most agriculture, fruits and vegetables are grown in the US. But despite the proximity to LA and SF, right, it is still a very socioeconomically depressed area. And so we intentionally started our company there. Our engineers, our employees are there. We're partnering with a fairly new California university, University of Merced, right, in the work that we do. And so I think, one, sort of defining inclusion in that sort of broad sense of frontline community, right? Who's working? Why are we working? Right? Who's solving the problems? How do we bring, right, farm workers into product design? How do we bring growers into, designing the solutions alongside our entrepreneurs, the local universities, local students? And so I think it's central to everything that we are trying to do, but it is challenging as well, right? I thank you for that question, because I think it's a very important one.
Yeah, thank you. Any thoughts from you, Abar?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really resonate with what Suma is saying, that I think one of the things that often gets overlooked is the communities we serve, right? So it's like, we have a nice technology, because we understand that it might solve a problem, but whose problem are we trying to solve? And so we see lots of time technology being pushed down, but the acceptance isn't there, because no one asks whether those technologies are needed. And I've seen in my work with local communities, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, I've seen so many great projects on ground that no one uses. You'll have eco toilets one place, or you'll have these clean water boards that really no one asked for. And I think that's the biggest challenge. How do we start from a bottom-up approach as well? That we ask the communities we serve what is their biggest challenge, and it may not often be the challenge that we focused on. And unless we don't match that, it will never be taken up, because you're pushing people in a different direction that is not their immediate need. So for me, the biggest thing about equity is, how do we build that trust? If I'm an entrepreneur, I'm someone who's bringing technology, how do I build the trust and also walk away when I know this technology will not serve the purpose that I want? And I think that openness needs to come in. How do we build those things? But we're also seeing, I think climate is one of those challenges or sectors where it doesn't really have a geography, right? It doesn't have a boundary. What happens in one place affects the other place as well. So it really requires all these different actors, all the world to come together. And so some of those guiding principles have to be set up. Like, how does the world work together on this problem? Whose problem? And what we're seeing and what we're hoping is this whole notion of ownership, that countries own their problems, right? They come up and say, this is what's required. Every country will have its own slight different dynamics, which may not serve any other country. So right now, from an equity perspective, everything that we understand about climate is carbon, because it's driven by where the funding is coming from. It's driven by the technology. So it's transport, it's clean energy, but no one focuses on the other part of climate. And so because it's not being demanded or the money isn't supporting that. So suddenly tech investor will say, oh, that's not my problem. That's a problem for the government to solve, or it's a problem for, multilaterals to solve. They'll push you away. And I think for me, equity will come in when we really focus on the real problems, not something that can just generate money. And we're hoping that through dialogue, through research, through conversation, through amazing entrepreneurs like Suma, who's really focusing on food, we can bring those narratives forward and say, actually, that's the real problem. That's the problem we need to solve.
Thank you. Just reflecting on that and linking back to your earlier comments about, what does it take to scale, and that piece of the discussion. And scaling is not taking one intervention or technology and replicating it everywhere. If we need to have the bottom up, ground up, listening to what each community needs, scaling is much more varied. The pace may be quite different, and it involves lots of working across differences and much more participation.
Absolutely.
So lots of challenges, but really, really important. I want to just ask one last question of each of you, and then we'll open it up to questions from those of you here in the room and online, which is just identify for us one trend that you're seeing, one key trend in terms of where we're going with the climate tech ecosystem and the financing piece of the ecosystem, or one or the other. Maybe Jamil, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I think there's a lot of interesting trends, of course. One that I was talking about actually last night with some friends and colleagues was that I think that there's this, and I think it's related to what Abrar was saying a second ago around being mindful of non-mitigation related needs, right? And I think, and this is actually, I guess, two trends I'll share here. One, just in terms of the inclusion and adaptation bit, I think we need to acknowledge that there's people on the ground in vulnerable countries that are already building, like with or without us, right? That it's partially an equation of, figuring out what their needs are and figuring out how to support them, but it's also recognizing that they know this territory a lot better than us and that they have already started to prepare, right? And so how do we provide tailwind to that is really critical. The other trend that I think I'm really excited about is that I think there's this convergence between the world of conservation and biodiversity and the world of climate tech that would come up periodically in the research, where people would say, insight around the voluntary carbon markets, or MRV technology, or the need to label it planet tech, not climate tech, and recognizing that conservation and biodiversity have a really big role to play in both mitigation and adaptation and resiliency issues. And so I would point to that as something to keep an eye on, because it's not, again, similar to where climate tech may not necessarily have been a mainstream trend a few years ago. I think nature tech is probably just a couple years behind at most. And so that conversion thing is going to be really important, but also really critical for how we ensure inclusion and adaptation in vulnerable communities.
Okay, thank you. Suma.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I want to second Jamil's point around the expansion of the definition of current climate to include emissions reduction, sort of the mitigation, but adaptation and resilience. And I think more and more people are resonating with that. 2 years ago, when I tried to talk to climate investors and I said food and ag, they wouldn't talk to me, right? And 10 years ago, renewable energy, right, was all the rage too. But so now seeing those same climate investors saying, oh, it's not just about building efficiency, it's not just about emissions reduction, like let's be part of the bigger picture. I think the second, and I know you asked for one, but can't help this, as an entrepreneur, I think one of the most exciting things I'm seeing is the level of open source collaboration that is happening and emerging models that are thinking about new ways to innovate. So university, like venture studios, right, around how do you co-create companies, right, that might take university tech transfer technologies combined with a venture capital fund, combined with a serial entrepreneur, right, who's trying to, and I think that type of collaboration is happening kind of at the startup level, but also from a global perspective, right? The one question when we were having our parallel conversation is like, how do we take things that are built in the global South and apply them to the US? How do we take things from Europe and apply them to the global South, right? And this is understanding that the models aren't just global north to south, right? That it's south to north. It's everywhere that we're seeing really fantastic models, right, being created. And if we have platforms like this, right, where we can share the models, I think we'll be solving kind of problems in a really interesting and pretty energizing way.
Okay, thank you. You've gotten me excited. Abrar.
So maybe I'll take kind of parallel. So I agree with all of those, but one thing that I'm noticing a lot more is these regulations coming in within business, because often when you look at large businesses, you know, they're sometimes last to react, but they will react once the policy and regulations are there. So we're seeing a lot of innovation that's happening in the reporting standards, in how companies have to identify their risks. They're already doing this, but to bring them to the forefront. And I think those conversations I'm having more and more. Before, like last year, 2 years ago, especially in Global South, if I spoke to companies about sustainability, they were like, nothing to do with us. But now they're saying, you know, actually we're part of the supply chain. If we become sustainable, we're actually helping our buyers. So I think that connectivity I'm seeing, and a lot more conversation I'm seeing, and I think that's fantastic, that regulations may be another way to drive urgency and action. And we need all these sectors to come together. And especially if businesses around the world start to pay attention to this, I think it would unlock a lot of innovation. It would unlock a lot of finance, and it would also be a great opportunity for talent to be absorbed. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of talent will also go to businesses. So anyone who comes to me and says, you know, where should I work if I'm interested in climate? I say, you know, start talking to businesses, because they will need your talent, but you can also be very impactful because, you know, they're they're actually in business. So think about how you can engage with them.
Okay, thank you. And that resonates
Good.
very nicely with what we're trying to do across everything we do at the School Center, which is very much about impact within business as much as beyond business. Did you want to?
I was wondering if I could add one thing there, because it made me think of something when you're saying, Abrar, about, you know, maybe years ago you couldn't say, you know, sustainability, there was an interest. Just an anecdote. So, right, I'm in Memphis. You know, my stakeholders include farmers, and one thing I learned is the type of, like, how do you meet people where they are? Right. And so in the US, farmers do not like the word net zero. They do not like you to say carbon, and they don't like the word climate. Right. And so the word that they prefer is conservation. Right. And so I think just an acknowledgement that globally, let's meet people where they are. Right. Especially in this highly political charged environment. People care about the environment. Right. So let's use the words, right, that kind of match their mentality, their politics. Like, I don't think that hurts. So it's something that I'm learning, right, as someone who does, you know, kind of has been a city person, right? So just wanted to share that.
Thank you. No, absolutely important. The words, the language, and being sensitive to what the connotations are is really, really important. So I'm going to open it up to questions from those of you here in the room and also those of you online. Yes.
Thank you for all of the insights. My name is Fiona and I'm doing social data science master here, but I have experience in sustainability. You all subtly mentioned the importance of emerging economies, and often have been synonymous with China. Could you please give us some more concrete examples of either government or corporate actions in some of these ways?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question so everyone joining online can hear. The question is about emerging economies and examples of what's going on in those spaces in particular. Beyond China.
Beyond China. I can talk a little bit about Pakistan, because I come from Pakistan. I'm having lots and lots of conversations. I think one big thing that's happening, again, I'll come from this regulation perspective, right? That the stock exchanges, the security exchanges are really picking this whole notion of sustainability, climate. They're bringing those regulations in very quickly, and that's happening across the world. The timings might be different, but that's one lever that these countries are using. How do we get businesses more engaged in that process? And many of the emerging countries that I speak to, business I speak to, they're part of the greater supply chain. And often, like, if you look at Indonesia or Bangladesh, India has many brands, but they really, are part of that bigger picture. And for them, their buyers are also coming in a lot, saying, can you show us that, is a zero cotton or a zero net zero cotton, or can you show us your conservation measures? And for me, the conversation is, don't wait for that. That's your competitive advantage. If you start to already meet, as Suma's point, already meet people where they are, you take 3 steps forward, actually you become very attractive. And we've seen, for example, Bangladesh as an example, Bangladesh doing, the textile sector coming together and then getting funds from the Green Climate Fund for the textile energy conservation. So they're saying, how can we start to reduce our emissions? Although that's not the top of their mind, but that actually helps their buyers, because then they can show, look, we're a low emission manufacturing entity. And you can find many of those examples across those emerging economies. But I'll defer to Jamil as well. He's spoken to many entrepreneurs. Maybe that's something you can add to.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can we just repeat the question once more? I want to make sure that I heard the full version.
Yeah. About what's going on in emerging economies, and I think the role of governments in particular.
Sure.
Beyond.
So here's the way that I think we're thinking about it, both in terms of the report, but also in some of the work that Suma and I are doing in parallel with Riffle. So you have, I think, this very unprecedented situation, right, where out of nowhere, a lot of emerging market economies are getting asked to make really bold decisions around their climate actions, but they've never been asked to do so before, right? And that can come in the form of, John Kerry flying over and having a meeting with his counterpart in a certain country. It could also mean the various regulations around scope 3 emissions that are affecting trade relations, right? They have to make all these decisions, and there's no precedent for it, right? Like, they've never been required to think about this before. They've never asked to allocate resources for it. But sometimes we forget that the people that they're hiring to put into these roles to make these decisions have also not received, oftentimes, a lot of training. And I think the same goes for countries in the OECD as well. So it's kind of happening globally. But I would go back to my earlier point, is that there are people building already that know these industries extremely well, right? So some of our partners in Senegal, I don't know if, can you hear us now, or? I think they froze.
Jamil, I can hear you.
That's good. Feels good to be heard. Okay. Well, not to put anybody on the spot or anything, but Rona, I saw you were on here. Do you want to share what the COP team is doing? Because I feel like you guys have a very, very interesting agenda when it comes to climate tech in the global south. Unless you'd like to stay off of, nobody was asking. I know you weren't expected to speak today, so. But
no, thanks for giving me the opportunity actually on this, and thanks for the report. And I'm looking forward to reading it later. And also let me say that actually some of our conversations helped shape our work when we spoke early on. So definitely thank you for that. The way that we've approached technology and innovation and entrepreneurship at COP has been on taking an ecosystem approach. As several of the speakers here have mentioned, you need the government, you need corporates, you need entrepreneurs, you need VCs, you need everyone to come together to make this work. And so our work has revolved around those streams. So very, very, very quickly, we launched 2 accelerators with partners that targeted companies mostly from the global south. One of them focused on 100 early stage startups. That's New Energy Nexus. And then McKinsey works on a program focusing more on scale ups. We also launched the Innovate for Climate Tech Coalition, which we helped facilitate and which actually Riffle are members of. And again, it would take a long time for me to get into the details here, but please look up the coalition online. And if you'd be interested in joining, reach out to us. We're looking to onboard partners. But again, the objective of the coalition is to bring different players together to support the climate tech ecosystems of the global south. In addition to that, at COP28 itself, we have a couple of different initiatives ongoing to support entrepreneurs, and again, with focus of those from the Global South. So one, we have the Startup Village, where over, I think, close to 200 startups will have the opportunity to be there at COP in these sort of kiosks in a really nice location in the technology zone. We also have the Climate Innovation Forum, which is a really amazing technology conference with some really, really cool speakers. And then we also have the stage in the Technology and Innovation Hub, which Riffle Ventures is also playing a key role in with programming. This is for free. The TNI Hub stage is free, open to anyone and everyone at the Green Zone if you'll be at COP, with programming running all day, every day on all sorts of interesting topics, including some of the ones which came up in this call, as well as COP Connects, which is a networking event which happens every day. And again, we're trying to focus on supporting in these events climate tech entrepreneurs, and especially those from the Global South.
It's awesome.
That's phenomenal. There's a ton there. I feel like now we're moderating a panel about what COP28 is doing around tech and innovation. So this was all part of the plan. I think, Suma, you've got to run. Now I'm going to moderate you, Suma. I think you have to run, right? Because you have to go
No,
pitch.
I'm good because my pitch is not, I'm on CT right now instead of ET. So I actually have a little time.
Oh, perfect. Then if anybody wants to stay for the next hour and list. So let's see who else is on the call here. Well, actually, if people are open to it, I'd love to just kind of open up a conversation and ask on people, because I'm seeing some amazing folks here. Like we got Mark from Source, we've got Soteria. I mean, do people just want to have a conversation?
Yeah, any thoughts, questions?
If not, I'm just going to start calling on people, starting with Soteria.
There are a couple hands raised. I think Keith has had his hand
I
up.
knew you were going to do that, but no, go to the hands raised.
Okay, we can't hear Keith. What about I?
All right, yeah, this is Ian Tran. I submitted 3 questions earlier, but the first one was a question about whether there's any intention to make this report more of an iterative process with more participatory leadership from the marginalized communities, or led with them.
Of all the problems, I want to ask you to give us a ray of hope, and we're going to close on that. So I am mindful that it's 4:30 and there's some lovely drinks behind us. So I'm going to pause us here and invite you, first of all, to join me in thanking Abrar, Jamil, and Suma. And thank you all for bearing with us with the tech issues today. Thank you for a wonderful discussion.